Good morning. It's now 10 o'clock and this inquiry is resumed. This is an inquiry into an appeal made by Battleton Estates Limited under Section 78 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990 against the failure of the council to determine a planning permission for a hybrid planning application seeking detailed planning permission for Plot 1 and outline planning permission for Plot 2. Plot 1, West Wing, comprises two tall buildings and associated developments. Plot 2, that's East Wing, comprising outline planning permission for two tall buildings and associated development. All matters reserved. That development is proposed to take place at Battleton Town Square, North Battleton, SS 141BA. Few housekeeping matters. I've received a number of documents overnight, or yesterday, should I say. I received Essex County Council final SIL compliance statement. I'm taking that as inquiry document 19. I received a site visit itinerary map and email package. That's IQ 20. There are a couple of emails toing and froing on that. The council SIL compliance statement. These are final SIL compliance statements and appendices. I'm taking that as inquiry document 21. I received a revised suggested list of conditions. Can I just check, is that an agreed final list? Agreed between all parties, the two main, council and appellant?
Madam, I understand that it is agreed, and as I'll be corrected if that's not the case.
Okay, thank you. And then inquiry document 23 is the final that came through yesterday evening, is the final version of the section 106, and we've already spoken about arrangements to ensure that an executed version is submitted by the 28th of January. Is that everybody's understanding? Before we move on to closings, can I just pick up on a few points on the agreed revised list of conditions, and parties can be working on that while we're listening to closings. Few small points. Condition 10. Is it clear, precise? It's the last sentence. I would suggest something like, without delay upon completion, the desktop study and non-technical summary for the relevant phase shall be submitted to and approved in writing by the local planning authority, as opposed to having that clause at the end. To me, that wasn't clear, wasn't precise. 14 and 15, we spoke about those two conditions. That's the archaeological condition and a historic building recording. You gave me a sound reason for those conditions. Can you just make sure that I've got it in the written version? Do forgive me, I'm looking at this on screen. That's why I'm not looking at the camera. Condition 28, clause B of that, the approved details shall be implemented prior to occupation of the relevant phase and shall be maintained at all times thereafter. Condition 28, condition 44 deals with SUDS maintenance. And I want you to look at the relationship of clause B of condition 28 to, sorry, have I got that the right? Yes, to 44B. So the relationship of condition 28B to 44. 44 deals with SUDS maintenance. Condition 47, a small point on that, but that That deals with car parking, blue badge parking spaces, management plan. Part B deals with the plan. The plan shall be implemented in accordance with the approved details. You know, it's the parking spaces, isn't it? The agreed details shall be implemented in accordance, not the plan. 53. That is dealing with amenity space, and at the moment we've got clause B that says the approved detail shall be implemented prior to occupation of the relevant part of phase 2 and shall be maintained at all times thereafter. Does that mean, are you looking to retain that? Is that a retention clause? If it's maintained, maybe that needs a bit more detail. I think it's retained. Sorry, Miss Lawrence, are you nodding there?
Yes, yeah, no, I agree with you. Thank you.
That's fine. And then we've got condition 58, super fast broadband. Same point, prior to occupation of the development, all residential, non-residential use within the phase shall be fitted with super fast broadband capacity and shall be maintained at all times thereafter. Do you mean retained?
Yes, I will. Yeah, I would agree with you. Thank you.
Okay, and then accessibility. That's condition 59, and we spoke about this, didn't we? And this is requiring the provision of M43. And what you've done is you've broken it down to 10%. So you've made it more specific: 10% block B, 10% block D. I raised a query on that. Have you got an answer for me?
The applicant had proposed M43 dwellings as part of the application that is set out within their residential unit schedule.
Okay, and would you have nomination rights for those units?
No.
Okay, is anybody else able to help me on that? Okay, can you look at that condition? My understanding is M43, local authority would be able, you'd be able to enforce that condition if you had nomination rights. Please, can you check up on that and come back to me?
Okay, we will do.
Otherwise, I'm concerned about that condition. Those are the only comments that I have. They're small points to address, and what I would expect is that you address those while we're listening to closings, and then I'll take that away. I'll take a Word version away at the end of the inquiry.
Thank you. We will address those. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. Okay then. Any other points that we need to address before we listen to closings? Could I ask, have you sent your closings through?
I have, yes.
Yeah, I often have this problem that I don't get things for, if you've noticed, I don't get things first thing in the morning. I get things late at night, but I don't get them up. Not to worry, not to worry. I'll listen. If you've sent them through, that's absolutely fine. I just like to scroll a bit, you know, but never mind, that's absolutely fine. Could I invite the council, please? Would you like to make your closing statement?
Yes, Madam, thank you very much indeed. As I said, they have been sent through to your case officer earlier on this morning, and I've sent them both directly to Mr. Hill and Miss Hall.
Thank you.
Lawrence will have sent them, or will send them directly to the appellant and the Rule 6 parties wider team.
Thank you.
Madam, by way of introduction, in these submissions we summarise, following the close of the evidence, the council's case by reference to the two main considerations that you have identified. We will touch on the council's position on housing supply, and we'll address the planning balances. First, however, and as we did in our short opening statement, we record matters which are not contentious, and those are these. Firstly, the council cannot demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply, nor does housing delivery in the borough meet the government's policy requirements. As such, the policy approach to securing sustainable development, as set out in paragraph 11D of the framework, is engaged. Thirdly, in the circumstances, substantial weight should, the council accepts, be given when discharging the planning balances to the contribution that the appeal scheme would make to housing supply in the borough. Fourthly, Battleton Town Centre is an appropriate location for growth and for new housing development. The council has no objection, indeed it supports appropriate increases in density of development in the town centre and commensurate appropriate increases in height. The council recognises the need for and the benefit of, and thus supports appropriate regenerative development within the town centre. We emphasise the qualification appropriate here, and we address what is and is not appropriate when addressing the main considerations later in these submissions. And fifthly, the council does not resist redevelopment on and within the appeal site. However, what is done must meet the policy requirement for sympathetic and high quality form and design. And the extent to which the appeal scheme is successful in this respect has generated the main issue between the appellant and the council. Further, by way of introduction, we turn briefly to the development plan. It is common ground that SAVE policies BAS-B12 and BAS-TC1 of the Battleton Local Plan 2007 are the most important policies for the determination of this appeal. These policies are, it's agreed, deemed to be out of date by operation of footnote 8 within the framework. It is agreed, however, that both policies, to the extent relevant to this scheme, are consistent with the framework, and as such, neither SAVE policy is in fact out of date with regard to either's consistency with government policy. Weight can be attached to these policies, therefore, in the tilted balance, as Ms Jones agreed in cross-examination, in accordance with the Gladman case, and we return briefly to this below. For completeness, it is agreed that the relevant policies of the emerging Battleton Borough Revised Local Plan 2014 to 2034 are at a stage where these attract limited decision-making weight. The appellant's case, and that of the Rule 6 party, is that the evidence base in support of the emerging plan attracts very limited weight. In these submissions, and save in respect of Mr Ireland's evidence concerning housing land supply, we have not addressed in any detail the evidence and case for the Rule 6 party. Neither Mr Hancock nor Mr Mumby consider the merits of the appeal scheme. Mr Hancock's evidence essentially seeks to justify the introduction of taller buildings, and the council does not resist this this in principle, but does oppose these tall buildings, a matter which Mr Hancock does not consider. Mr Mumby does not address the application of policy to the appeal proposals or the planning balance. Their evidence is thus of a general and non-specific nature, and as such, and with the utmost respect, as little by way of informing the determination of the main issues in this appeal. We turn then to the main considerations, and the first of those is the effect of the appeal proposal on the character and appearance of Battleton Town Centre, with particular regard to height, scale, massing, and architectural treatment of the proposal. We begin with the existing baseline. The history of the concept for and the evolution of Battleton as a new town is well recorded in the evidence. We do not repeat that history. With regard to the existing character and appearance of the town centre, it is common ground that the original and current scale of the development in the core of the town centre, including surrounding Brook House, is 2 to 5 stories, and it is not suggested that the existing larger scale development, which is located in peripheral locations away from the core of the town centre, in any way qualifies this. The appeal site, which sits in the core of the town centre on the north and west sides of Town Square, conforms and contributes to this general and prevailing character. Brook House, it is common ground, makes an important contribution to the character and appearance of the town centre, and indeed the wider area, as Mr Macawa confirmed in cross-examination. The appellant has addressed its contribution in the HTVIA. The appellant's assessment is that Brook House is the landmark building at the heart of the town centre, highly visible from many neighbourhoods in Battleton. The appellant also says that the scale of the tower was intended to form a landmark in a town which is otherwise consistently low scale. The appellant says that the scale of Brook House means that it is visually prominent, even dominant feature in the surrounding townscape. And we respectfully agree with the appellant in all these respects. Mr Macawa, unsurprisingly, reaches the same conclusion. The DAS, produced by Mr Macawa's practice under his leadership, identifies Brook House as undoubtedly a standout building, and that its height and slenderness are a counterpoint to the low-rise nature of the surrounding townscape. The DAS described Brook House as an iconic building which became a defining feature in the town centre and Battleton's first strong visual marker. Mr. Macawa and the DAS are therefore aligned with the HTVIA. Miss Markham's mild reluctance to agree with the HTVIA, which was produced by her practice under her guidance, does not detract from the reliability of the conclusions reached within that assessment. Moreover, the assessment in the HTVIA of the townscape function of Brook House, with which the Council agrees, is in large measure reflected in the conclusions of Mr. Rose in the recent Orwell appeal decision. Mr. Rose's assessment has been much referred to, but it is worthy of repetition nonetheless. He said this: "It can be said without controversy that Brook House provides a landmark function in the town centre, arising from its height, bulk, and architectural design and detailing. Brook House remains preeminent because of its distinctive form and the contrast provided by much lower buildings along the main pedestrian spine. This is most notable around East Square, East Walk, and Town Square." Mr. Rose's conclusions, Brook House is a landmark and preeminent, accord generally with the assessment of the Council and the appellant as we've set out. Miss Markham's initial suggestion that the preeminence of Brook House was derived from architectural form, not height, and that is what Mr. Rose had in mind in paragraph 38, did not withstand more than a moment of scrutiny. Miss Markham in cross-examination accepted that its height, including relative to its surroundings, contributed to the preeminence of Brook House, as indeed it plainly does. That is obviously what Mr. Rose was referring to when in paragraph 37, when paragraphs 37 and 38 of his decision letter are read sensibly as a whole. Before moving to policy and impact, we mention briefly history. The appellant has persisted with its case that, within the initial concept for Battleton Town Centre, Brook House was not envisaged as a single tall building, but was in fact intended as the first of many. Like Mr. Rose, Madam, you have been taken to a series of publications dating from the 1950s and 60s. We do not go back to these, intrinsically interesting though they may be. What we say is revealed in these publications is that, to some extent at least, the lack of height above the prevailing datum of the town centre was lamented, but that the remedy for this was the introduction of Brook House as a landmark building. And consistent with this objective for Brook House, that other comparable buildings were envisaged is unlikely. Moreover, there is nothing whatsoever in the articles themselves that suggests plurality, forgive me. In any event, it's common ground that Brook House is in fact a landmark, the building in Battleton Town Centre, the appellant says. It is common ground that Brook House is preeminent, derived in part at least from its height comparative to its surroundings. That is the townscape contribution now, and it is against that contribution that impact falls to be assessed. What was or was not within the minds of the commentators in the 1950s and 60s is really nothing to the point. We turn then to policy. There is little between the parties here. Given that the tilted balance is engaged, the main policy context is provided by the framework at paragraphs 130 and 134 in particular. This is supplemented by the National Design Guide. What is required is that development is visually attractive, sympathetic to local character and history, including the surrounding built environment, and that it establishes or maintains a strong sense of place. Development which is not well designed should be refused. And safe policies BAS B12 and TC1, which require development to be sympathetic and appropriate to the area, and that harm to the character of the surroundings should be avoided, conform, as we've noted, to the framework. The National Design Guide advises in particular that tall buildings require special consideration. We turn then to impact. It is informative to step back here and reflect on the bare facts of what the appellant seeks to do. Tower A, at 23 stories and of a height of 76.7 metres above ground, will exceed the height of Brook House by some 27.5 metres. Tower B will exceed the height of Brook House by 13.4 metres, Tower C by 10 metres, and Tower D by 16 metres. It is plain, therefore, that in terms just of height, each of the four towers proposed would exceed by some margin the height of Brook House and will introduce the tallest buildings by far into the town centre. Moreover, the development would bring tall buildings to within 60 metres of Brook House in the form of Tower D. All of these towers would be within the same city block as Brook House, as the appellant has agreed, and will be located within part of the town centre that provides the lower level counterpoint to Brook House that the appellant recognised as important in its stats. The impact on the landmark function and the preeminence of Brook House must be considered in this context. The appellant accepts that the effect of its scheme will be to envelop or to subsume, we say, Brook House into a cluster of tall buildings. And Miss Markham, in her proof of evidence, says that Brook House will form one of a group of tall buildings rather than pair as existing. All the proposed towers are also taller than Brook House. The proposed towers would be visible in the skyline and would change the skyline silhouette seen in conjunction with Brook House, and the proposed development would therefore reduce the prominence of Brook House in the townscape. That is indeed the effect of this scheme, and it is not positive, we say. The effect on the landmark function and preeminence of Brook House must again be considered in this context. And there is, of course, no precedent for Brook House to become one of a cluster of tall buildings within the original concept or subsequent evolution of the town centre, as we have already said. We turn then to the appellant's assessment. It is quite candid in its HTVIA, at least. It says this: the creation of new residential blocks in the same city block as Brook House will reduce its visual prominence so that Brook House forms part of a cluster of tall buildings. The blocks will form new landmarks in the town centre. The proposed blocks will change the skyline silhouette and will be visible in conjunction with Brook House in key views. The development will fundamentally alter and improve the setting of Brook House. Save that the impact on setting is not positive, a matter to which we return below, we agree with that assessment. It is quite impossible to reconcile this assessment of the effects of the scheme with maintaining or being sympathetic to the landmark function and the preeminence in the townscape of Brook House. To subsume a landmark building into a cluster, as the appellant seeks to do, can only conflict with and damage its townscape role and function. Its prominence and dominance, as the appellant puts it, will be lost, or at least very much reduced. The important counterpoint of Brook House to its much lower scale development adjoining it to the west will be lost, and this existing relationship, the counterpoint, is one which the appellant itself recognises as being of value. As such, Mr. Lowndes is quite right to find significant townscape harm. The exercise of considering the impact of the proposed towers on the townscape role of Brook House through a series of viewpoints, as set out in particular by Mr. Rose, is instructive. We refer you, Madam, to Mr. Lowndes' evidence in this regard, no doubt assisted by yesterday's site visit. The quantum, the greater height, and the closer proximity of this series of towers to Brook House, when compared to the Orwell development, generates a much more acute and harmful impact. Moreover, we do not accept that the singularity of Brook House has already been lost, as it was put to Mr. Lowndes in cross-examination. That is not what Mr. Rose concluded, and to the extent that he found in paragraph 45 that singularity had been eroded, that was plainly by reference to one view, namely from the eastbound platform of the railway station, from which the view of Brook House would nonetheless retain its strong landmark function. By contrast, and as Mr. Lowndes confirmed, the effect of this scheme would be to extinguish Brook House's singularity by introducing a cluster of much taller buildings into a location much closer to Brook House as compared to the Orwell scheme. And from the eastbound platform in particular, the proximity of the development here would be seen much closer to Brook House. In conclusion, the impacts found by Mr. Rose cannot sensibly be applied when considering the impact of this scheme. More generally, in terms of townscape impact, views eastward from St. Martin's Square will be very substantially and adversely changed, as the height and scale of what is proposed will dominate and overwhelm the space. The focus of the church, and in particular the bell tower, would be lost, particularly in views from the north. Unlike the Orwell scheme, this proposal cannot sensibly be seen as a recessive in views from the north, into and from within the square. And to the extent that improved legibility to St. Martin's Square from the station was desirable, that function has now been delivered by the approval of the Orwell scheme. The dominance we've referred to when seen from St Martin Square applies with equal force and effect from within Town Square to the west of Brook House, looking westwards. These townscape impacts derived from form and especially height and scale are aggravated by elements of the elevational treatment, including in particular the conspicuous verticality introduced by the use of randomly arranged piers over twin floors in Block A and the full height vertical columns within Tower B. None of the finesse which is provided within Brook House to moderate verticality with horizontality is delivered here. In conclusion, therefore, the policy objective of delivering a visually attractive series of buildings which are sympathetic to local character and history and maintain a strong sense of place is not met. What is proposed is unsympathetic and out of character, and is a development which is not well designed. The policy at 130 and 134 of the NPPF is not met, nor are the requirements of the SAVE policies in the development plan. Indeed, by the appellant's own admission, what it seeks to do is to utterly transform the core of Battleton Town Centre. That is demonstrably the wrong starting point, which should be to introduce development which is sympathetic to the existing character. More was revealed by Mr. Macau's evidence. It is plain that he sees his role as being essentially to redesign and masterplan the townscape of Battleton Town Centre. That, with respect, is not his role, nor is it the function of this development. This tends to highlight how very far off the mark the design evolution and response here has been. What is also notable is the absence of any meaningful explanation of the rationale for what has been proposed, particularly in terms of height. The DAS refers to early massing studies, which led to a series of point towers, option 3 being preferred. However, no other explanation is given as to why 4 towers of up to 23 stories, and originally more, was arrived at as the appropriate design response. The DAS states that different locations and heights for the towers were considered. To assess the composition in relationship to Brook House. But no further explanation of the process is given, nor are the strengths and weaknesses or reasons for rejection of other options which it is said have been assessed. Given the transformative effect of this development in a sensitive location within a low-rise townscape adjacent to and providing the counterpart for a listed building, an explanation of why the height and scale proposed was arrived at is to be expected. This is notably absent, and this aggravates the harmful townscape impacts and the lack of any justification for those effects which have been addressed earlier in these submissions. Before moving on, we mentioned the absence of a design code. As a matter of fact, no design code has been forthcoming so as to inform the preparation of this scheme. The scale parameters which are set out in the DAS are a legal requirement and do not perform the function of a design code in any meaningful way. And they certainly do not, for example, inform elevational treatment or materials. What is proposed is a major intervention in the townscape through 4 very tall and prominent buildings. They form a group and will be read together. Internal coherence within the development is critical to the acceptability of what is proposed. The design code would help to secure this. This is particularly the case given that part of the scheme is in outline, and this is the part closest to Brook House. Neither Mr. Macau nor Miss Jones have been retained by the appellant to deliver phase 2, and it is quite reasonable to assume that phase 2 may be delivered by a different developer. Mr. Macau was candid in confirming that maximum flexibility was sought as the development moves forward, if indeed it's consented. This objective of itself rather emphasises the need for a design code to ensure that what comes forward is coherent, consistent, and thus acceptable. For the avoidance of doubt, a design code is not just a nice to have, as the appellant has suggested. That is plainly not the council's position, and it does the appellant no credit to dismiss the function of a design code in this way. All of these factors underline the importance of securing an understanding and a commitment now as to what the development as a whole will deliver. The council was quite right, therefore, and Mr. Dawson was quite right, to highlight this as an important omission. Indeed, had a design code been developed at the outset, some of the mistakes of the present scheme could, perhaps, have been avoided. By way of conclusion, the Council does not oppose in principle redevelopment here. Indeed, it recognises the benefits of change in the town centre. The Council does not oppose increasing the prevailing density in the town centre. Indeed, it recognises that this is necessary. What the Council does oppose is the delivery of these outcomes in an inappropriate form through development which is unsympathetic in townscape terms, which damages what is of value, and which represents poor placemaking and design. That is what is proposed here. I turn then to main consideration 2, the effect of the appeal proposal on the special architectural historic interest of Brook House, a Grade 2 listed building and designated heritage asset, with regard in particular to its setting. It is common ground that there is an overlap between the townscape role of Brook House as a landmark building and its significance as a heritage asset. The Council, at least through Mr. Murphy, considers that its setting, from which its landmark role and preeminence is derived and appreciated, contributes to its significance. We've addressed at some length the effect of the proposed development on the landmark function and preeminence of Brook House earlier in these submissions. And many of the points we raised apply with equal or even greater force to the impact of the scheme on Brook House as part of the historic environment. We will not repeat all that we've already said. It should be regarded as incorporated into our case in respect of main consideration 2 nonetheless. And on this basis, our further submissions on main issue 2 are short. The contribution of the landmark function and preeminence of Brook House to its significance seems to accord with the view of the appellant as set out in the HTVIA. The references, which we have included above to paragraphs 516 and 518 of the HTVIA, including the scale of Brook House means its visually prominent, even dominant feature in the surrounding townscape, is within part of the assessment which assesses the contribution of setting to heritage value. Indeed, that Brook House is a landmark building and a symbol of the new town movement, and this contributes to its significance, is the conclusion, of course, of Mr. Rose. Against this background, it is unsurprising and unsatisfactory that Miss Markham felt compelled in her oral evidence to dismiss largely the role of setting and the landmark role of Brook House to its significance. We've set out earlier in these submissions the appellant's own assessment of the impact of the scheme, the introduction of a cluster around Brook House to its significance, and we refer in particular to the HTVIA at paragraphs 828 to 835. The appellant says that the creation of the towers in the same city block as Brook House will reduce its visual prominence, as indeed it will. And as Mr. Murphy made clear, visual prominence contributes to significance, and thus the impact here is clearly harmful to that significance. It is notable that in respect of development which is less tall and further away from Brook House, Mr. Rose found that harm to the significance of Brook House would be caused. It is implausible in the extreme, therefore, for the appellant to seek to maintain a case that a development which is materially taller than the Orwell scheme and Brook House, to be located closer to Brook House, will cause no harm at all. And given greater height and proximity, it cannot be claimed here that the development would appear distinct in form and character, set well apart from Brook House, as Mr. Rose found in respect of the smaller, more distant Orwell scheme. As such, it is right to find, as the Council does, harm to the significance of Brook House, which in policy terms is less than substantial, in the lower to middle of that range. The listed building is not preserved, and in law, this harm must be given substantial weight and importance. The appellant, somewhat surprisingly, says that there are heritage benefits here. We disagree fundamentally. So far as any positive townscape's effects are concerned, these are not benefits in terms of enhancing the significance of the asset, as Mr. Murphy explained, and as such, there is nothing beneficial in terms of improving the significance of the asset. And we return to the balance of paragraph 202 of the framework later in these submissions. We turn then to housing, land supply and delivery. And the Council has made it abundantly clear. Its position on housing, land supply and delivery in the borough and the policy consequences which follow. There is a dispute between the parties as to the extent of the shortfall. The Council says the supply is 2.88 years, the appellant says it's 1.3 years, and the Rule 6 party says it's 1.7 years. In our opening statement we submitted, given that the consequences of undersupply are agreed, that there is little of benefit in seeking to resolve the difference between the parties as to the precise level of supply, and we maintain that this is the case. Nonetheless, the evidence has been given on this topic. We do not propose to rehearse the council's case in respect of each site which was examined at the roundtable discussion, or indeed each of the typologies. We will, however, address certain matters of approach. And we turn then to the first of those matters. There is a difference between the parties as to whether, and if so, in what way, account can be taken of evidence which is relevant to establishing the deliverability or otherwise of a site, which postdates the council's monitoring base date. Following the discussion, it now seems to be accepted by the appellant and the Rule 6 party, that account may in principle be taken of evidence which postdates the base date. That is surely right, and accords with the Secretary of State and his inspector in the Woburn Sands decision. However, the appellant in particular is wrong when it says that such evidence can only be taken into account if the decision maker, here you, madam, are satisfied that a site met the test of deliverability at the base date. In effect, so the appellant says, you must first look back and satisfy yourself that a site was deliverable at the base date on the basis only of evidence available then, and it is only if a site is found to be so deliverable at the base date that evidence which postdates that base date can be taken into account. That is, with respect, fundamentally wrong and inconsistent with the approach accepted in Woburn Sands. What the Inspector and Secretary of State in that decision concluded is that evidence which postdates a monitoring base date can be taken into account so long as a site is identified as deliverable at the base date. And we refer you, madam, in particular to paragraph 12 of the Secretary of State's decision letter in Woburn Sands and Inspector's report, paragraph 1211. This is in distinction to an entirely new site, which is not included as a source of supply at the base date. As such, so long as a site is included as a matter of fact in the council's supply at the base date, evidence which postdates that date is admissible, and there is no requirement to conduct an elaborate two-stage test whereby the position as it was at the base date on evidence available then has to be examined first. The appellant's case, to the contrary, is wrong, is inconsistent with Woburn Sands, which is plainly a material consideration here and should not be followed. The approach clearly established in Woburn Sands also avoids the absurd situation whereby, for example, the grant of planning permission in October 2021 for development of Great Oaks Retail Park, which of itself puts deliverability beyond doubt, must be ignored, whatever the position was in terms of available evidence at the base date. The appellant's approach, which compels you to discount such evidence, in fact, we say defies common sense and reason. Secondly, Mr. Rose's decision is, of course, a material consideration here. However, in respect of several of the sites in contention, the Council has introduced in this appeal additional evidence that was not before Mr. Rose. An example is evidence concerning the progress made on bringing forward development on car parks 2, 12 and 14. Where such new evidence is forthcoming, Mr. Rose's conclusion should not, without further consideration, be followed, and the circumstances of the site should be reviewed again. Thirdly, there is supply from the Hela sites. The common circumstances which apply to those sites has been explained, in particular council ownership and control, and the council's commitment to bring forward delivery of such sites through its Housing Delivery Action Plan. Such sites can, in principle, meet the policy test of deliverability set out in the glossary to the framework, and for the avoidance of doubt, planning permission, applications or allocation are not, of course, prerequisites to deliverability. Mr. Rose considered that some allowance should be made from such sites. It is right that he was not specific as to the scale of allowance. He did, however, suggest that the level of supply may be taken as the midpoint of the range between the parties. The Council suggests that a reasonable approach would be to take account of 50% of the Hela supply as deliverable, and to do so seems a reasonable response to Mr. Rose's comments and approach. The appellant and the Rule 6 party seem to be saying that no account should be taken at all, and to do that would be to persist with the undue pessimism for which they were criticised by Mr. Rose. The Council's approach is therefore to be preferred. Fourthly, planning permission has been granted or resolved to be granted after the monitoring base date for new homes on sites which were not included in the identified supply at that base date. And these are Trafford House, development at Renewal Road, and at Market Square. That's the Orwell decision. These cannot be added formally to supply today, as Woburn Sands and the decision in Woolpit, core document E20, provides, as none was identified at the base date. However, the council says that account should be taken of this additional supply when considering the weight to be attached to the formal 5-year housing land supply assessment. We turn then finally to the planning balances. Before so doing, we address the approach to be taken to the benefits of the scheme. As the council has acknowledged, the contribution of this scheme to housing supply is a consideration of substantial weight in both the paragraph 202 balance and in the paragraph 11D tilted balance. The appellant advances a long list of other asserted benefits to the scheme. This list should be approached with very considerable caution. First, the appellant advances as benefits of its scheme outcomes which are straightforwardly requirements of planning policy. Delivering cycle parking was referred to in the cross-examination of Ms. Jones. Ms. Jones attaches substantial weight to these matters, and as such, these are not lesser factors, as Mr. Hill suggested when re-examining Ms. Jones. Ms. Jones acknowledges now that it was wrong to take these considerations, which are in substance policy requirements, into account as benefits in the planning balances, or at least to attach to them weight that she did. Secondly, Ms. Jones attaches substantial weight to, for example, Section 106 contributions and the provision of local infrastructure. These two are requirements to address the impacts of the proposed development and are not benefits as such. Again, Ms. Jones conceded this point. Thirdly, Ms. Jones attaches substantial weight to delivering high-quality development in the form of build-to-rent units and communal space for residents. Again, as outcomes, these are consistent with the necessary application of policy. These are not benefits, and again, Ms. Jones agreed. And it follows that many of the inputs Ms. Jones introduced into her planning balances were not legitimate. Ms. Jones's approach should not, therefore, be followed, and in light of her concessions, her conclusion overall as to the outcome of the planning balances is, we say, flawed. A further area of dispute concerns benefits which any policy-compliant regenerative development on or including the appeal side can be expected to deliver in whole or in part. As was put to Ms. Jones, and as she eventually seemed to have accepted, if a benefit can be shown only to be achievable by a particular development, then this is a factor which can increase the weight to be attached to that benefit in the planning balance. However, the corollary must also then follow. If a benefit can be expected to be achieved by any policy-compliant development, then this must reduce the weight it attracts. As such, whether the benefit is limited to a particular scheme or whether there are other alternative and less harmful schemes which would deliver the same or similar benefits must logically be a relevant consideration. The appellant has not offered any evidence whatsoever to show that it is only this appeal scheme which can be delivered on the appeal site, and therefore it is only this scheme which will realise the regenerative benefits advanced. It has hinted at viability constraints, but has not brought forward any evidence to demonstrate such constraints. As such, it has not been shown that the benefits relied on through regeneration are only achievable by this scheme, such that to secure those benefits, any harm which this scheme generates, which we say is considerable, must be accepted. This must plainly, and as a matter of common sense, reduce the weight attributable to those regeneration benefits within the planning balance. And I'm going to take you, if I may, just to this footnote 7 at this stage. The conclusion of Mr. Rose in the Orwell decision of paragraph 114 is, of course, acknowledged, but that conclusion was reached by reference to the evidence adduced by that appellant. It is not and should not be elevated to a conclusion in principle about the consideration of alternative forms of development. I turn then, if I may, to the main text, paragraph 55. Indeed, the need to consider alternative means of securing benefits in a less harmful way is expressly the advice of Historic England when considering the impact of tall buildings on the historic environment. The appellant's constant refrain when confronted with this advice There are no alternatives, it says, does not withstand scrutiny. It is right that the appellant has chosen in its evidence not to address alternative regeneration opportunities at the appeal site, but that is far from demonstrating that there are no alternatives. If the appellant had wished to argue that no alternatives exist to achieve those benefits, e.g. through a less dense or less tall development, it needed to produce evidence to support this. And for the avoidance of doubt, to do so is not the role of the council. Indeed, the council's development appraisal results of December 2021, rather not 2020, 2021, shows that build-to-rent schemes in the town centre of a much smaller quantum to that proposed here are viable, and that many levers exist to support viability of schemes more generally. Turning then to the striking of the paragraph 1202 and paragraph 11D balances, these are of course matters ultimately of judgment. The council commends to you Mr. Lowndes' approach, and that the harm to the townscape and the historic environment cannot here be excused. It is not necessary to accept what is proposed here to secure positive outcomes for Battleton Town Centre. The balance should be struck in favour of dismissal of this appeal. And Madam, you are requested by the council to dismiss this appeal accordingly. So, Madam, unless I can be of any further assistance to you, those are the closing submissions on behalf of the local planning authority.
Thank you very much, Mr. Edwards. Miss Hall, could I invite you to make your closing statement?
Thank you, Mum. I too have sent them through to your case officer, and apologies if they've not actually made their way through to you. Okay, thank you. The current appeal, the recently determined Market Square appeal and Infrared's own appeal all raise an issue as to the acceptability of tall mixed-use buildings within Battleton Town Centre. As such, a number of cross-cutting issues arise within the three appeals, which fall for determination as part of this inquiry, and in which Infrared has a clear interest. Infrared provided expert evidence from Mr. Hancock on the identified main issues relating to, firstly, the character and appearance of Battleton, and secondly, the significance of Brook House as a designated heritage asset. Mr. Ireland provided evidence as part of a roundtable discussion on 5-year housing land supply, and Mr. Mumby provided expert planning evidence to the inquiry. In short, Infrared's position is that regeneration of the town centre is not only desirable in a general sense, but is in line with the council's own aspirations and is desperately required in order for the council to accommodate their own identified housing needs. Turning to the first issue of heritage and townscape, in order to properly consider the sensitivity of the existing townscape to change, it is necessary to first consider the historical context, the initial master plan vision, and then the actual delivery of that master plan. In that context, it is notable that Brook House was not part of the initial master plan. And in that sense, Brook House is something of a retrofit, albeit a very successful one. Further, the master plan was delivered in a piecemeal fashion and wasn't delivered with any singularity of vision. No party to the inquiry suggested that there was any identifiable building of merit aside from Brook House, and the council has not objected to the loss of the original buildings on the appeal site or on the Orwell site. Indeed, Kenneth Brown is particularly scathing about the early implementation of the master plan, which he saw as a, quote, complete visual write-off prior to the construction of Brook House. This is in contrast to other new towns such as Stevenage and Harlow, which, I've abbreviated Mr. Hancock to LH in my written text, so it's going to just translate it because you haven't got the document. Having it, as Mr. Hancock explained, has an integrated and unified design, and they were implemented accordingly. Battleton is not a conservation area, and nor is it one of the best examples of a new town. Accordingly, when one considers Battleton in the round, it should be seen as being a new town less sensitive to change than other more intact examples. Mr. Hancock also explained that Battleton, along with other new towns, hasn't aged particularly well in terms of meeting the needs of today. The segregation of cars and pedestrians and the car-centric design has led to town centres which are physically cut off from residential areas by large traffic corridors. This is true of Battleton, where the town centre is an island surrounded by a difficult-to-navigate ring road, so that the journey from residential area to town centre involves crossing a dual carriageway and navigating through car parks and the unattractive rear of large shopping centres. It's therefore of little surprise that Inspector Rose considered that Battleton was on a, quote, well-advanced downward spiral of decline. And this too goes to the sensitivity of the townscape, as plainly the town requires some updating. As Mr. Hancock explained, the real elements of value in Battleton are to be found in the central core rather than the degraded periphery. There was some agreement between the parties on this point, as Mr. Lowndes agreed that the east-west axis was the most important to preserve. Mr. Hancock's clear evidence to the inquiry was that this area was the most sensitive to change. It is this central core where the original master plan was most closely implemented and where it is still most legible today. As Mr. Hancock explained, one does not have to stray far away from this spine before you enter areas of the town centre which haven't been built in accordance with the master plan and no longer retain very much connection to the 1957 ideals. Indeed, there are also harmful intrusions into the core itself, such as the Marks and Spencer's building and the more modern Eastgate Centre. In terms of Brook House, the central spine is also where Brook House is best viewed, and the area from which Mr. Lowndes, Mr. Hancock and Miss Markham all agreed contributed the most to the appreciation of Brook House. Insofar as singularity is important to the appreciation of Brook House, it is here that any singularity and prominence or dominance remained. Mr. Lowndes stated in chief that Brook House still retained its singularity, quote, in the important views up and down the east-west pedestrianised spine, and it is no surprise that the money shot postcard of Battleton is always taken looking east along Town Square towards Brook House, and I give a reference in my written document to Mr. Murphy's figure 11. In close range views, the striking set-piece relationship with the sunken East Square is apparent, together with the steps rising to the three-storey pilotis. They can be appreciated together with the finer architectural details, such as the V-shaped windows. It is that relationship with East Square which was notable to Kenneth Brown and to the author of the list description, which refers to, quote, the bold and subtly profiled pilotis, together with the siting of the block forward of the adjacent building line to the west and facing the sunken square to the east, gives a significant townscape role to the building. Accordingly, as Mr. Hancock explained, it is these closer range views which contribute most strongly to the significance of Brook House as a heritage asset and also provide the best appreciation of Brook House's townscape role. Brook House as a heritage asset and as an element in the townscape is far less sensitive to change in mid and longer range views. As Mr. Hancock explained, whilst it's a tall building, it simply isn't tall enough to have a dominant presence in mid or long range views. And in many of the mid-range views around the town centre shown in the HTVIA, it isn't possible to see Brook House at all because it becomes hidden by the existing townscape, even by its current lower height. In terms of longer range views, these add very little to the appreciation of Brook House today. None of the finer details of its architecture are apparent at that distance, and it is frequently seen together with other tall buildings in the town centre, and particularly Great Oaks House. Once the Orwell scheme is constructed, it will form part of a cluster of tall buildings when seen from a number of more distant vantage points. Accordingly, the core of the new town and its east-west axis is the area where the new town master plan is most legible and most sensitive to change. Outside the spine, the quality quickly degrades and sensitivity to change rapidly decreases. Further, Mr. Lowndes' assertion that change from the prevailing 2 to 4 stories townscape is harmful needs to be seen in the context of the change promoted by the council. The new urban capacity study is the latest in a suite of town centre proposals by the council, which promotes radical change in height and density in order to accommodate an increasing number of new homes. The council itself promotes development of up to 13 stories on the appeal site, whilst at the same time recognising that this quantum of development wouldn't actually be viable. Turning on to the second chapter in 5-year housing land supply, even on the council's case, the supply is at 2.8 years. That is well below the 5-year requirement, and it's beyond doubt that the starting point is therefore the tilted balance. The council has now had a great number of attempts at providing clear evidence to support their claim trajectory across this inquiry and the Orwell inquiry. However, as explained by Mr. Ireland in the roundtable discussion, clear evidence as required by the PPG is still wanting in relation to a large number of sites. Inspector Rose's very recent conclusion that a substantial portion of the council's projected supply does not attain the threshold of deliverability remains true. Inspector Rose's more detailed conclusions also hold good. First, at paragraph 92, he reached the clear view that permissions granted since the base date should be excluded. This remains the case. The Woolpit decision remains correct. The planning authority's reference to Woburn Sands doesn't assist them, as this referred to sites which were deliverable at the base date, and Mum has a reference there to paragraph 12.10 of that decision, and the relevant sites here were not deliverable at the base date. At paragraph 95, Inspector Rose concluded that there was no clear evidence that sites on the brownfield register would come forward. Again, this remains the case. Wickford Car Park is still a car park, it's not available. Wickford Health Centre is still a health centre, and Church Walk is still a job centre. Plainly, they are not available now. Nothing new has been provided on Car Park 14. Overall, it remains the case that the council has not demonstrated that there will be clear evidence of completions on brownfield register sites in 5 years. Turning to Inspector Rose's paragraph 96, there he concluded that there was no clear evidence in relation to Car Park 2 or 12. In relation to 12, this is currently in use as a COVID testing facility, and Car Park 2 is currently still a car park. Both require HIF funding to be spent in line with a timetable. That timetable has slipped a number of times and relies upon the refurbishment of Great Oaks Car Park, which still hasn't happened. The council provides no detail of the timescales that any appointed consultants are working towards, and there is uncertainty as to whether the HIF funding timescales will be extended. Whilst there is an intent to deliver, this falls short of clear evidence that it will actually happen within the 5-year period. At paragraph 97, the inspector discounted all Battleton Council-owned sites within their future building programme, stating there is no firm evidence to support the prospect of delivery. This is where the inspector applies the correct test required by the NPPF and PPG, i.e., is there any clear evidence? And his answer was no. Discounting the contribution from this category by a 50% marker is arbitrary and isn't evidence-based. The absence of site-specific evidence should result in them all being removed from the supply. In relation to Hela sites, the council has still, after numerous attempts, failed to provide site-specific evidence as to suitability, achievability, yield, viability, progress, and development timescales. The council continues to rely on a number of sites which are currently in use as open space and are held by the council as such. Disposing of council-owned open space has its own hurdles to be met, in addition to meeting the planning requirements of the NPPF and emerging plan to demonstrate that the specific site is surplus to open space requirements. No site-specific evidence was provided in that regard. These sites are simply not suitable or available now. The applications which have been submitted on such sites are for reduced numbers from those contained in the Hela, namely Great Chalverton Hall and land at Long Riding. It's entirely possible that some of these sites may come forward within the relevant 5-year period, but the PPG and NPPF require clear evidence and a robust assessment, and the onus is on the council to provide such evidence, which it has not done. At paragraph 98, Inspector Rose reached the view that the extent of supply was 1.7 years. In 98, the inspector applied the correct test. Is there clear evidence? To which his answer was no. And there we say the matter should end and nothing more is required in terms of calculating the numerical extent of the shortfall. His later view at paragraph 100 that the Rule 6 party stance was unduly pessimistic is difficult to square with his clear conclusion at paragraph 98, in which he applies the right test and reaches a view that the shortfall is 1.7 years. If regard is going to be had to the steps to make good the shortfall, which themselves fall short of clear evidence of delivery in 5 years, then we say the correct approach would be for this to be taken into account when considering weight to be given to the shortfall, but not to amend the numerical calculation of the extent of the shortfall. In any event, there's no reason to be anything other than pessimistic. The council seeks to argue that it can deliver the near 1,000 homes per annum that it needs, when historically it has persistently failed to deliver anything like it. It's a 20% authority, which now has a housing delivery test score of 41%, the 7th worst nationally. Whilst it may have an action plan, it's clear that something far more radical is needed. And in the meantime, consents need to be granted to stem the tide of an ever-growing housing need, which is going unmet. Turning to relevant policy, as Mr. Lowndes accepted, only 2 development plan policies are cited in the reasons for refusal, and both are out of date. Moreover, when both are considered on their terms and in the context of the supporting text, they provide somewhat weak reasons for refusing the scheme. Whilst TC1 is cited in the reasons for refusal, Mr. Lowndes accepted that it should be seen as to some extent supportive of the scheme in its support for mixed-use development, and the clear direction set by paragraph 8.1, which is supportive of refurbishment and redevelopment in the town centre, and that TC1, quote, in particular promotes mixed-use developments. The council also relies upon alleged conflict with only one part of a 7-part policy, and therefore, Mum, even if you found some conflict with TC1 Part 5, that is only part of the exercise in terms of applying the policy as a whole. BE12 also needs to be seen in the context of its supporting text, which makes it clear that it is primarily aimed at residential and visual amenity of adjoining residents, rather than being a townscape policy proper. The NPPF needs to be read in the round. Mum, even if you found some conflict with paragraphs 130 and or 134, that is only one of the NPPF's aims. The NPPF promotes often competing aims, but we say has a clear emphasis on 1, significantly boosting housing land supply, 2, making efficient use of land, and 3, promoting brownfield development. These strands have been somewhat underplayed by Mr. Land, who notably omitted to refer to any of them within his proof. He also failed to accord the substantial weight to reuse of brownfield land, which paragraph 120C requires. Given the significant ground which had to be made up by Mr. Lowndes in chief in terms of the missed inputs into his planning balance, it should be clear that his balance was anything but. Turning, Mum, to the town centre master plan and strategy, the 2012 master plan predates any up-to-date housing requirement and doesn't reflect the current emerging policy, which provides for over 4,700 dwellings in the centre. The 2012 plan was predicated upon accommodating 1,500 to 2,000 units in the centre, and plainly the heights it proposes, being an average of 4 to 7 stories, need to be seen in that context. In short, it's been wholly superseded by events and should be afforded little weight. The 2021 capacity study hasn't yet been the subject of formal consultation and remains at an early stage. It is also subject to a number of flaws. Primarily, the scenarios it promotes haven't been demonstrated to be viable. The council appears to promote scenario D because that's described as the preferred development option within their committee report, and I give the reference. However, only scenarios A and B were subject to viability testing and are shown to be demonstrably unviable. The council therefore hasn't demonstrated that their own ideas of how 4,700 units can be accommodated in the town centre are deliverable in plan-making terms. It should also be noted that the capacity study has a 15-year timeframe, so it's only ever an answer to providing a small portion of the 4,005 units it aims to accommodate within the 5-year timeframe, and cannot alone be an answer to making up the 4,000 unit shortfall within a reasonable period. All 3 master plans and strategies have followed common themes though, and have all provided for increased height and increased density in the town centre. It's therefore clear that any vision for the town centre as part of the emerging local plan or otherwise will likely result in a document which provides for taller buildings, at least 4,700 units, greater density, and greater connectivity between the town centre and its residential areas and transport routes. These are all common sense aims, which accord with many of the themes of the NPPF, including reusing brownfield land, optimising density, supporting regeneration, locating development in sustainable places, and recognising the benefits of mixed-use schemes. It is also clear from the site-specific discussions on the town centre sites as part of the 5-year land supply roundtable that many of the town centre sites require and benefit from HIF funding in order to be deliverable. Plainly, the town centre has viability issues, and if Battleton is to benefit from the comprehensive regeneration that it needs and the council wants and has been attempting to plan for, instead of turning down redevelopment proposals, the council should be looking to viable and deliverable schemes like the appeal scheme with some enthusiasm. Further, in Battleton particularly, accommodating a large number of homes in the town centre makes very good sense. The alternative is large-scale greenbelt release, and attempting to argue that the presence of Brook House and a new town centre layout amounts to an exceptional circumstance to justify it. Well, in conclusion, we say the headlines given in opening remain pertinent. The claimed housing land supply is woeful, but is still a significant overestimate. The true position is around 1.7 years, being a shortfall of around 4,000 units. The need for housing is therefore chronic. The town centre is a sustainable location, involves reuse of brownfield land, avoids extensive greenbelt release. It is a location in line with the aspirations of the NPPF, the current plan and the emerging plan. The council lacks an adopted plan to provide for those homes in a way which would set a threshold for height in the town centre, or to dictate where in the town centre they should be located. There is an acknowledgement that accommodating the required numbers will result in increased height, but the council lacks any document which provides a clear direction as to where such height should be located. The council's attempts to do so are either so out of date as to be actively unhelpful, i.e. the 2012 plan, or are demonstrably unviable, i.e. the capacity study. This, coupled with the housing shortfall, means that relevant policies are out of date, and the council has lost the right to be choosy about where and how high. As the recent Orwell appeal demonstrates, the Townscape and Brook House can accommodate other tall buildings without undue harm. All parties agree that the town centre is in decline and requires change, height and density. The baseline for assessing the impact on the town centre and Brook House now includes the consented development approved at Market Square. The result is that Brook House will be seen together with other tall buildings and will no longer be the tallest building. Harm, therefore, needs to be judged in that context. And the key question will be the extent to which any proposal affects the largely intact and more sensitive east-west axis, rather than simply viewing any taller buildings as bad. There is plainly capacity and need for schemes of the nature and scale of the appeal proposal within Battleton Town Centre, and we say any harm would need to be of a significant scale to warrant refusal in the face of the chronic need for housing in this location and the acknowledged need for regeneration. Mum, unless I can assist you further, those are my closing submissions.
Sorry, thank you very much, Ms Hall. It's 6 minutes past 11. I intend to take just a short break because it's intensive listening. Can we take just a quarter of an hour break, and then we'll listen to Mr Hill's closing. I will expect, by that time, I will expect the council to have that revised list of conditions.
Thank you.
I don't know if you've got any update for us on that.
Yes, yes, madam, I've received some emails. Miss Lawrence just wants to have a word with me about this M43 point. So I'll do that in the break and we'll provide it to you, unless there's any particular problem, that will provide it to you during the break.
No, that's absolutely fine. Okay, so we'll come back. It's now nearly 10 past. If we come back at 25 past, and we'll have Mr Hill's closing. Thank you very much, everyone. The inquiry is adjourned. Good morning, everyone. It's now 11:25. The inquiry is resumed. Mr. Edwards, do you have an answer for us on that condition, please?
Yes, Madam, just to update you, a amended condition list either has or is about to be sent to your case officer addressing the points that you've raised.
Thank you.
I can help you with regard to condition 59.
Yeah.
I can either do that now, Madam, or later, whatever's more convenient for you.
Mr. Hill, do you mind if we just deal with this point now before we move on to you?
Not at all, ma'am.
Thank you. Mr. Edwards.
So far as condition 59 is concerned and the requirement for the delivery of M43 units with their accessible units, you're absolutely right that the PPG in the chapter addresses standards, residential standards, says in terms, just give me a moment, I'm just going to pull it up in front of me, paragraph 9, that local plan policies for wheelchair accessible homes should only be applied to dwellings where the authority is responsible for allocating or nominating the person to live in that dwelling. So that is local plan policies for wheelchair accessible homes, which is M43. The position here is the reason why the condition's been suggested is because the appellant is expressly offering to deliver M43 units. And that is set out in the DAS addendum CDD8 at page 127, CDD8 page 127.
Yeah.
And so, Madam, the reason, the necessity of the condition is not to comply with a local policy, but it's actually to secure the development and ensure the development is delivered in the form in which it has been advanced and is set out in the DAS and therefore has been consulted on. So that's the reason why the condition is applied. So it doesn't, in my view, conflict with the MPPD. That's what's dealing with policy.
Okay. And that reason, if that reason's changed and reflected, oh, thank you. Thank you. Mr. Hill, do you have anything to say on that?
Ma'am, no, I think I'm content to accept Mr. Edwards' account of why that's in there. And he's correct that it was part of the proposals as advanced to the authority. Okay.
Thank you very much for that. And I'm sorry, Mr. Edwards, did you say that that amended list is on its way to me?
Yes, Madam. Just give me a moment. Yes, it was sent to your case officer and to all other recipients of the usual emails at 11:26. So just a few moments ago.
Okay. Okay, I'll confirm when that's come through. Okay, thank you very much for that. Mr. Hill, can I invite you, please, to make your closing statement?
Thank you very much, ma'am. Could I just say in advance that I have sent to your case officer and to Mr. Edwards and Ms. Hall the most up-to-date version of my closing submissions. That supersedes one that I had sent to your case officer before the inquiry opened this morning. I did that so you had a chance to have something in front of you and get a sense of how long the submissions would be. But during the course of the morning, I've tried to incorporate any responses that I've needed to make to what Mr. Edwards has said in this final version. I'm not sure whether either has reached you, but just to avoid any confusion at a later stage, it's the later email that supersedes the one that was sent earlier this morning.
Okay, and I can confirm I have the amended version in front of me now. I also have the closing submissions of Mr. Edwards and Ms. Hall. Thank you. Thank
you very much indeed, ma'am. And ma'am, I think I'll be about an hour, just to give you an indication of time.
Thank you.
This appeal, ma'am, is made by my client, Battleton Estates Limited, following the failure by the council to determine BER's application for the redevelopment of land to the north of Town Square, as we're all now very well aware. The appeal proposals, as I recorded in my short opening submissions, represent a major long-term investment in the town by BER. they will, and I repeat myself deliberately, utterly transform a core area within Battleton Town Centre, which has for far too long languished, largely vacant, woefully underused, and increasingly down at heel, into a vibrant new heart for Battleton. But this is not the starting point, utter transformation, as Mr. Edwards mistakenly suggested in his closing, but the conclusion of the design process. As we reach the end, ma'am, of week 2 of this inquiry, it has had a rather surreal quality. Notwithstanding the very substantial scale of the proposals, not a single member of the public or third-party interest group has addressed the inquiry. And of course, this mirrors in many respects the minimal number of written objections made to the planning application. Moreover, at the inquiry, the vast majority of time has been spent considering the effect of the appeal proposals upon Brook House, 1960s tower block, which has recently been described by the leader of Battleton Council as unfit for human habitation, whilst a comparatively small minority of time has been focused upon the very extensive range of the benefits which will flow from the scheme, most of which the Council does not contest, but which, as we shall see, have received only the most cursory attention in its evidence. There's no criticism of the conduct of the inquiry nor the issues which it has addressed, but it reflects, ma'am, I think I can fairly say this, the very narrow debate which we've been having, and the need to stress in these closing submissions the importance of the bigger picture and the urgent needs to deliver housing, jobs and renewal for Battleton, which is plainly where so many people's priorities rightly lie. I turn to some matters of approach before I delve into the detail now. What are the remaining issues? And I group them in this way. First, what is the weight to be attached to the benefits of the scheme seen in context, including the scale of the 5-year housing land supply? And in my submission, ma'am, this should logically be addressed first in order to inform and enable the weighing exercise as referenced below, which explicitly require weight to be attached to the benefits of the scheme. Next, whether there is any less than substantial harm to the setting of Brook House, and if so, whether that would be outweighed by the benefits associated with the appeal scheme using the standard balance pursuant to paragraph 202 of the framework. If so, if that balancing exercise is undertaken favourably for the scheme, this addresses paragraph 11D lim 1 of the framework, and the tilted balance is agreed to be engaged. And one moves on to that for item C, whether the appeal proposals would have any adverse effects on the townscape of Battleton or any other adverse impacts, and if so, whether they would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits of the scheme using the tilted balance pursuant to paragraph 11D lim 2 of the framework. So I turn then to the first of those, the benefits of the appeal proposals in context and the weight to be attached to them. Our account of the benefits of the scheme is set out through the evidence of our witnesses, in particular that of Mr. McCower, Ms. Markham and Ms. Jones, whilst Mr. Austin Fell addresses the current 5-year housing land supply picture in his proof and rebuttal. Ms. Jones addresses the issue of weight carefully in section 8 of her proof. By contrast, Mr. Lowndes for the Council confines his consideration of the benefits and the weight to be attached to them to one paragraph of his proof, having devoted 70 pages to the alleged impacts of the proposals. It's submitted, ma'am, that this simply cannot be an appropriate way to approach such a critical issue in circumstances where the weighing exercise is central to the performance of a professional planning witness's duties at the inquiry. Indeed, it was for this reason that my cross-examination of Mr. Lowndes spent some time considering his approach. During cross-examination, he accepted that the balancing exercise required of decision makers is only effective if the correct factors are loaded into the balance and if appropriate consideration is given to the weight that should be attached to those factors. That the weight to be attached to the benefit should not be moderated by reference to alleged impacts before the weighing exercise is undertaken, or the impacts will be double counted. although this was an exercise which he just performed in his own examination in chief. That he had in fact made no attempt to discuss, assess, or contextualize the benefits of the scheme in his proof in order to explain and calibrate the weight to be attached to them. And fourth, that his assertions that the benefits would accrue from an alternative scheme were not founded upon any other comparable scheme whose viability had been tested, but were entirely generalized in their nature. In my submission, ma'am, this is a wholly unacceptable way for a professional planning witness to proceed. Mr. Lowndes did not consider it necessary either to do the exercise properly in his main proof, nor by rebuttal in response to Miss Jones's section 8, nor in his examination in chief. And this suggests in my submission that the outcome of the balancing exercise, when undertaken by the council, was preordained, and I submit that you should not rely upon its conclusions. By contrast, Ms. Jones has sought to draw the evidential threads together in her section 8 and to give a summary account of the benefits of the appeal proposals to which she attaches weight individually. The factors to which she attached substantial or very substantial weight were not challenged, and I submit that her exercise, whilst inevitably the product of judgment, was carefully explained and robust. I do not intend to rehearse or repeat the benefits in full in these closing submissions, but invite you to refer back to Ms. Jones's section 8 in due course. But I do pause to mention her 4 heads discussed at her paragraphs 8:15 to 8:31, which weren't challenged. First, making the best and most effective use of land. Here, the framework mandates that substantial weight should attach to the value of using brownfield land to deliver the development needs. However, the appeal scheme is not simply a site clearance exercise. It seeks to incorporate and reuse where possible existing structures with all their embedded carbon and to repurpose old retail accommodation, 42% of which is currently vacant on the site. And Ms. Jones attaches substantial weight to this factor in accordance with the framework. Making a substantial contribution to housing supply, it's unarguable that nearly 500 dwellings would make a substantial contribution to Battleton's woefully deficient supply. The weight to be attached to this factor is agreed by Mr. Lowndes to increase proportionately as the 5-year housing land supply depletes. Ms. Jones judges the weight to be attached to this factor to be very substantial. I return to this matter in more detail below, but I note that Mr. Rose in the Orwell decision letter found that the provision of a substantial amount of new housing in a highly sustainable location, providing choice and diversity in the local housing market, is a factor of very significant weight. And it's difficult to see why a different conclusion would be justified in relation to the BEL scheme. Avoiding unnecessary release of greenbelt. This is to some extent a consequential impact of 1 and 2 above, but it's vitally important to recognise that Battleton has no easy options to remedy its chronic housing supply shortfall. So unless brownfield opportunities are properly exploited, long designated and highly valued greenbelt land will be lost and inevitably developed in a less sustainable way than a town centre site with virtually no vehicle trip generation or parking requirement. Again, this should attract substantial weight. Fourth and last in this list, the renewal and reinforcement of Battleton Town Centre, as Mr. Rose put it in the Orwell decision, on a well-advanced spiral of decline, evidenced by vacancy in buildings which will not be reused in their current form. There is a consensus that these areas are in need of regeneration. Mr. Lowndes accepted that this paragraph applies equally in the current appeal. And the scale of the mixed-use scheme which the appellant proposes is very large indeed and covers retail, leisure, community and workspace users, as well as extensive improvements to the public realm, internally and externally, and at various levels across the site. Substantial weight must again attach to this factor. Fifth, and summarising from the subsequent lists in Ms. Jones's section 8, as well as 151 construction jobs, there are permanent jobs, 432 net additional direct jobs, and 452 indirect jobs. the creation of around 1,000 jobs, only which a small number will be temporary construction jobs, is surely another benefit to which substantial weight must attach. In summary, and without attempting to undertake as exhaustive a review as Ms. Jones in section 8 of her proof, there is, ma'am, an exceptionally compelling matrix of benefits attaching to the appeal proposals, to which cumulatively a very substantial level of weight must attach in my submission. Mr. Lyons, as well as double counting by discounting weight due to alleged setting impacts before the final weighing is undertaken, has relied upon the proposition that, and I quote, many of these benefits would arise from an alternative replacement scheme that was more carefully designed so as to optimize development potential within its distinctive townscape context. As you've heard, ma'am, the appellant completely rejects this argument for the following reasons. The appeal scheme is the product of extensive initial optioneering by Makara Architects, 5 pre-app meetings, design amendments flowing from widespread consultation. It is not accepted, and there is no evidence that there are other viable options with equivalent benefits waiting in the wings or ready to go if the appeal scheme is prevented from coming forward. There is no plan-led or SPD-led scheme in existence which would perform this function. Indeed, the draft documents which the Council produced in December and which are due to go out to consultation this year consider very schematic approaches to the appeal site, each of which is unviable. And I give you the reference in the footnote, notwithstanding the consideration of multiple scenarios, each involving progressively deeper downward adjustments to the cost inputs. And contrary to Mr. Edwards' closing submissions, paragraph 55, there is no assessment of a viable lesser BTR scheme on the appeal site. Indeed, Cushman and Wakefield are extremely cautious about the very high-level nature of their assumptions for the one site where a BTR model was tested. Third, at no stage has the Council asked the appellant to test another bespoke option for the appeal site, nor has it developed any such option itself, nor via its consultants. Mr. Lowndes made exactly the same point in identical terms to Mr. Rose at the Orwell appeal. And you'll recall you've seen the extract from his proof to that inquiry, which is ID or IQ 14. Mr. Rose found that the scheme benefits of the Orwell proposal are not challenged by the Council other than in the terms that many would be realised by an alternative form of development designed to overcome the harm raised by the authority. Whilst it is true that some of the benefits would be generic, he says, the weight to be attached is scheme specific, and in the case before me, there is no other for comparative assessment. Frankly, the Council's position in this regard is based not on evidence, but upon pure speculation and assertion. And I invite you to take the same approach to this argument as Mr. Rose did when confronted with a near identical proof from Mr. Lowndes last year. And I add in here, ma'am, I didn't get time to type this in, and near identical submissions from Mr. Edwards. And I give you the reference here because you have the document before you. See Mr. Edwards' closing submissions at Orwell, CDE 27, CDE 27, paragraph 49, where he says, there is no basis whatsoever to conclude that if the appeal is dismissed for the reasons advanced by the Council, that an alternative form of development cannot or will not come forward which responds to the reasons for refusal. The appellant has not suggested to the contrary. The economic and environmental benefits associated with the appeal scheme would in large measure be delivered by any scheme on the appeal site, and so on. So, ma'am, exactly the same arguments, and I do invite you to take exactly the same approach as Mr. Rose did when confronted with them in the Orwell case. And I turn on now to 5-year housing land supply, the position at the close of the inquiry. And I'll address this relatively shortly, as we accept that although the scale of any 5-year housing land supply shortfall is directly relevant to the weight to be attached to the provision of new housing, it's not necessary for a precise figure to be identified. And secondly, because Mr. Rose dealt with the issue very recently in the Orwell decision. Mr. Rose found essentially that many of the council's purported sources of supply were lacking demonstrable evidence to support the prospect of delivery in the 5-year period. I'll give you the references. He concluded overall a substantial part of the council's projected supply does not attain the threshold of deliverability. This would diminish a robust assessment of supply to around 1.7 years. And I note this figure is very close to the appellant's and Rule 6 parties' assessments in this appeal. Mr. Rose then went on to note the inexact nature of the science and to give the council essentially the benefit of the doubt on some sites, leading to a final conclusion that the available supply is likely to be, at the very best, no more than the midpoint of the conflicting figures. And as we've seen, that is, and I give you the maths, 2.5 years. He describes this level of shortfall as clearly significant and concludes that the delivery of additional housing arising from the proposal should be given great weight in the planning balance. However, the council has not accepted the outcome of the Orwell appeal in its evidence, and even after further reductions from its opening figure of 3.3 years, is still asserting a supply of 2.88 years, which equates to a shortfall against the 5-year requirement of over 2,500 units. It became apparent at the roundtable discussion that the council officers appeared to have misinterpreted Mr. Rose's conclusion set out above in relation to overall supply. He was not suggesting a 50% discount where the deliverability of a given site was in doubt. Rather, he was recognizing that he'd not heard any oral evidence on the 5-year housing land supply and was identifying an upper ceiling for the supply. Having agreed in principle at paragraph 98 with the question marks raised by the then Rule 6 parties about the absent or deficient evidence of deliverability in relation to much of the council's purported supply. The appellant and Rule 6 party at this inquiry have now had an opportunity to review the frequently shifting evidential picture which emerged from the council at the Orwell inquiry, and they have produced carefully considered proofs of evidence which were served on the 14th of December. Their concerns were in fact very largely supported by Mr. Rose in the Orwell decision issued on the 17th of December. In my submission, ma'am, the concerns identified by Mr. Austin Feller, Mr. Oakley and Mr. Ireland for Infrared as to whether there is robust, up-to-date evidence in relation to the delivery of a large number of sites remain and have not been adequately answered by the council, which produced no rebuttal proof either responding to the other parties or to Mr. Rose's decision letter, which was, as I have observed, fairly trenchant in its findings about much of the council's purported supply. As I've noted, limited changes were introduced via the 5-year housing land supply statement of common ground. But I turn now to make some limited observations on the matters addressed at the roundtable discussion. In relation to methodology, Mr. Austin Feller set out the approach by which the supply should be interrogated. This follows closely the definitions of deliverable as set out in Annex 2 of the framework and relevant sections of the NPPG. Beyond this, his proof and rebuttal proof also make reference to a number of directly relevant appeals, which provide the context for how elements of the supply have been assessed by other inspectors, including most recently the Orwell decision. And the importance of not distorting the 5-year period for assessment has frequently been stressed by inspectors. Annex 2 of the framework provides a clear guide as to how the supply should be assessed. For those Category A sites, including minor schemes and those with detailed consent, there should be an assumption that these will be deliverable unless evidence provided by the appellant indicates otherwise. For those Category B sites, which form the majority of the council's supply, the onus is very clearly on the council to demonstrate how a site can be delivered in the 5-year period, supported by proportionate evidence. In the appellant's view, that bar has in many occasions not been reached, and there is little before the inquiry to support the inclusion of a large number of sites. This has been explored in the context of the site topologies presented by the council. And I turn briefly to these with just one short paragraph on each map. In respect of those sites in Battleton Town Centre, the appellant challenges 10 of the 12 sites, where the council say 1,392 units can be delivered from this topology. We say only 85. Of the 10, it's noted that 5 of those have seen planning applications submitted or obtained resolution to grant consent. However, we note those comments in the Orwell letter and many appeals before it, where it's clearly stated that information on sites new to the supply should not be considered, as this would distort the supply calculations. And we say that 552 dwellings should be removed here. The remaining 5 sites include sources from the Brownfield Register and other town centre sites. For these Category B sites, the onus is clearly on, that should say, the council to provide evidence to support the inclusion of these sites. Mr. Rose has recently determined that some of these sites, including car parks 2 and 12, should be removed from the supply, as the test for clear evidence had not been met. The council's had the opportunity to reinforce its position, but has provided little further evidence of substance. The appellant's view is that these sources, totaling 1,307 dwellings, should therefore be removed from the supply. The Round Table also considered 3 of the sites within Wickford Town Centre, where the council claimed a total supply of 214 dwellings from this topology. The appellant seeks a reduction of 157 dwellings. The council has already changed its stance in relation to 3 to 31 Runwell Road, the largest of the sites in this topology. However, the appellant does not accept the council's case that limited weight should be given to this supply. That's not how the 5-year housing land supply calculation works. The site is either in or out. In terms of the remaining 2 sites in this topology, both of these sites form part of the council's Brownfield Register, but in both cases there is no firm evidence of moving towards applications, and they should be removed from the supply. In respect of sites with planning permission, the appellant has challenged only 1 site at Gardeners Lane South for 255 dwellings. And consistent with the appellant's approach to this inquiry, he considers that planning consent achieved beyond the base date should not be considered now, but in the next iteration of the supply calculations. Lastly, turning to the supply from the Hela sites, the appellant challenges all 54 sites in this topology claimed by the council to provide 902 dwellings. Whilst the appellant noted that there were 2 applications registered with applications for 61 dwellings, these sites with no prior status should not be accounted for, falling beyond the base date. The remaining sites, including a large number owned by the Borough Council, were supported by only a very limited evidence base, with no certainty that schemes would be advanced in the near future, which would lead to a realistic prospect of development. Furthermore, as was noted in the Round Table, a number of those sites in the future building programme are presently identified as open space. Any proposals will therefore be in conflict with policy and would only be likely to come forward following review through the emerging development plan. Furthermore, the appellant does not accept the council's misconceived approach of subjecting the future buildings programme to a 50% discount. This figure is wholly without evidential basis and further supports the appellant's view that there is no credible evidence underpinning this source of supply. And consistent with the Orwell decision, paragraph 97, these sites should be removed. So in summary, and as explained at the Round Table, the appellant is of the view that the council's supply figure is greatly exaggerated. The council continues to rely on elements of supply in respect of which a clear negative view has recently been expressed in the Orwell decision. The council's had the opportunity to reflect on this decision, and yet still provides very little in the way of evidence to support the inclusion of these elements of supply, which, for the most part, do not benefit from any planning status whatsoever. The appellant submits that the following elements of the council's purported supply should be removed. This is in summary: the schemes with planning permission, 868 to be discounted, and if these are not discounted, this is the reason why the base date is so important. The calculation will be distorted, especially as agreed elements of supply which have been converted to completions post the 1st of April 2021 have not been removed. And that's why the distortion is such a danger. Second, no clear evidence of planning activity, and that's 1,630 dwellings to be removed. And that takes one to our figure of 1.3 years. Mr. Lyons agreed in cross-examination that his paragraph 1013 in his proof contained misguided optimism about the direction of travel for Battleton's 5-year housing land supply, Even the council's latest position of 2.88 years supply represents a very sizable and alarming shortfall, over 2,500 units, but the position set out by the appellant and Rule 6 party with a deficit of 4 to 4,500 units represent shockingly poor outputs, which must attract very substantial weight in this appeal, in my submission, ma'am. As a footnote, in addition to looking forward, it's also important to look backwards at the council's performance to date. It's common ground the council has failed the housing delivery test, a figure recently recalculated to be only 41%. And looking further back, we can see yet greater evidence of delivery concerns. Indeed, as identified in Mr. Austin Fell's proof of evidence, the council's poor delivery performance has been a consistent feature for many years. And we can see there's a considerable deficit in supply from 2014 when set against the period of the emerging plan. A shortfall of around 3,700 dwellings, equivalent to around 3.6 years of requirement. But this figure does not feature in the 5-year housing land supply calculation. We say it's important contextually for a borough which has been starved of new housing development for far too long and needs to grasp opportunities now for bringing forward sustainable housing and mixed-use development at scale. And I turn now, ma'am, to consider the sole remaining matters on which the council relies in seeking to resist this appeal, heritage and then Townscape, recognising that by taking them in that order, I can navigate the occasionally tortuous path between the relevant paragraphs of the framework. Heritage first. As I noted above, I encapsulate the heritage issues in these terms: whether there is any less than substantial harm to the setting of Brook House, and if so, whether that would be outweighed by the benefits associated with the appeal scheme using the standard balance pursuant to paragraph 202. It is happily clear that only Brook House needs to be considered under this head. Notwithstanding the sprawling extent of Battleton town centre covering over 65 acres, only a single heritage asset is considered to be affected by the council. Indeed, the Heritage Statement of Common Ground expressly confirms that there would be no harm to the raised pool and sculpture, the retaining wall, ramps, steps, staircases and raised paving, where they survive from the council's recent works, nor to the Church of St. Martin of Tours, which is non-designated but covered by the Statement of Common Ground. It is submitted that the rarity of the opportunity presented by the appeal site is underscored by the remarkable absence of heritage constraints in a town centre of the scale of Battleton's. Focusing then on Brook House. No works are proposed to Brook House, which lies outside the red line. The council is, of course, proposing all sorts of works to Brook House to remedy its unfitness for human habitation, decaying fabric, and other problems, but these are not part of the appeal proposals. Ms. Markham reviews recent applications in her evidence. Accordingly, any impact upon Brook House can only arise in relation to setting effects, and even the council does not suggest that such is other than less than substantial, to use the language of the framework. Whether or not harmful effects would arise would depend in turn upon the importance of setting to the significance of Brook House, and upon how any effects upon setting are judged. At the same time, it is agreed between ourselves and the council that you may properly and lawfully take into account any positive effects that will arise from the appeal proposals in coming to a judgment on whether and to what extent any less than substantial harm would arise. And I give you the relevant citations. Additionally, the courts have held that considerable weight should be given to the benefits as well as to any adverse effects. And again, I give you the citation and the core document reference for those authorities. It is the appellant's case that there will be no harm to Brook House arising from the appeal proposals. On the contrary, its wider setting will be dramatically enhanced by the renewal which the proposals will bring, and the complementary relationship which will arise between the podium and tower elements of the appeal scheme and its earlier neighbour at Brook House. And I refer you to the evidence of Miss Markham, who sets out the benefits and the design response in her paragraphs 182 to 193, and Mr. Macaw, who is an unashamed enthusiast for Brook House, has been directly inspired by it, has sought to improve its setting and create enhanced vistas of it from within the appeal site. Indeed, the appellant had directly in mind the advice of Historic England in Advice Note 3 as to how enhancement of an asset may be achieved by removing intrusive buildings or features, introducing new views, or otherwise improving the setting of an asset. It's necessary, ma'am, to study the list description of Brooke House in order to understand the significance of the building. And this will be a task well known to you, I know. The lengthy list description is dominated by the details of the building itself, its plan form, the striking pilotis, the innovative building materials used, and the access arrangements at close quarters. It is evident beyond peradventure that it's the architecture of the building which prompted the listing of Brooke House in 1998. The description notes the origins of Brooke House, designed to introduce high-quality residential accommodation into the town and visually to provide a dominant vertical landmark to counterbalance the predominantly horizontal emphasis of the surrounding shops, end quote. That part of the description accurately records the genesis of the building, and its perpendicularity is and will continue to be very much a feature of its presence in the town centre. But there's absolutely nothing in the list description to suggest that it was intended to remain the only tall building in Battleton town centre in perpetuity, nor that the urban drama or counterpoint between horizontal and vertical could only be achieved successfully at that location or by a single building. This would, of course, have been a nonsense, and indeed other tall buildings have subsequently appeared in the town centre, creating different contrasts. The planning permission is now being granted for 3 towers at Market Square, reaching towards or exceeding the height of Brooke House and introducing more perpendicular relationships to the town. As Mr. Rose put it in allowing the Orwell appeal, the proposed development would bring about change within the setting of Brooke House as a result of the introduction of a cluster of tall buildings. However, returning to the list description, what is perhaps the most interesting and directly relevant element is to be found in the next sentence. And I note that Ms. Hall also cites this paragraph. The bold and subtly profiled pilotis, together with the sighting of the block forward of the adjacent building line to the west and facing the sunken square to the east, give a significant townscape role to the building. Here, the writer of the list description tells the reader clearly what elements of the setting of the building generate its principal townscape significance. None of these elements of the setting, neither the forward projection to the west nor the dramatic relationship with the sunken garden to the east, will be affected by the appeal proposals. From further afield, in and around the town centre, just like the 3 recently permitted tower elements on Market Square, the additional elements on the skyline, I quote, would further lessen the focus of Brooke House. But the appeal scheme has to be considered against the backdrop of existing tall buildings in and around Battleton Town Centre, now supplemented by the Orwell permission. Ms. Markham and Mr. Hancock were absolutely clear in their evidence to the Round Table, the Heritage Round Table, that the former Brooke House, in more distant views of the town centre or in its skyline profile, was quite unremarkable, and that its significance does not derive from its presence in those views and would not have been sufficient to support or even materially contribute to the case for its listing. Rather, this flows from the architecture of the building itself and its local townscape role, both of which are unaffected by the appeal proposals. Additionally, unlike the Orwell scheme, and you've seen that, ma'am, in the station platform visualization, which is ID 10, the BEL scheme has sought from the outset to respond to reflect, and to take architectural cues from Brooke House, and dramatically to enhance its setting by injecting new complementary form and functionality into the whole urban block in which the appeal site and Brooke House sit. We also note that the appellant at the Orwell scheme conceded that its Market Square scheme would give rise to less than substantial harm to the significance of Brook House. Essex Place Services also took this view, so it's perhaps not surprising that the decision letter proceeds as it does, even though the council did not, as it happens, suggest that permission should be refused for heritage reasons. It will be a judgment for you, ma'am, but we do not consider that there is an aggregate harmful effect on the significance of Brook House arising from the appeal proposals. If you take a contrary view, then paragraph 202 of the framework is engaged, and it will be for you to weigh the benefits of the scheme against any less than substantial harm you may identify to Brook House. I've already set out our case in relation to the benefits associated with those proposals, and I note that Mr. Rose concluded when he was conducting the paragraph 202 balance in the Orwell appeal, and that's at paragraph 105, I give you the reference in the footnote, taking account the totality of the benefits arising from the proposed development, with particular reference to the provision of a significant number of homes in a highly sustainable location and the catalyst to the much needed regeneration of the town centre, this would outweigh the heritage harm that I've identified. Similar factors will weigh in the balance of the instant case, but it's critically important to note, as I do now, that the BEL scheme is much wider ranging in its size and scope than Orwell's, and incorporates very extensive retail, workspace, community, leisure, and potentially educational provision, as well as major improvements to a wide area of public realm. And in my submission, the public gains the benefits of the appeal scheme must surely outweigh any heritage harm which might be found to arise from any further lessening of the focus on Brook House if this is considered to amount to less than substantial harm. I note at this stage, ma'am, and I do apologise because I'm sure you understand all of this, but just to avoid any legal complications at a later stage, that this balancing exercise is a standard one rather than a tilted or weighted one, and that if it's concluded that the benefits outweigh any harm, then this addresses section 66(1) of the Planning Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act 1990 duty, and also addresses paragraph 11D1 of the framework. And I refer you there to the Coulson, Mr. Justice Coulson's decision in the Forest of Dean case, and give you the core document reference, in particular paragraph 37, where he holds, and of course one has to have regard to the changes in the framework paragraph numbering, which are always a bind, that once the paragraph 202, as it now is, balance has been struck favourably, then the tilted or weighted balance can take effect in relation to other issues considered to give rise to adverse impacts. And in this case, the only other issue is that of townscape impact, which is of course very closely allied to that of heritage impact in this case. And I turn to that next and finally. So townscape impact. And as I set out in my introductory section, now my approach is issue in these terms: whether the appeal proposals would have any adverse effects on the townscape of Battleton or any other adverse impacts, and if so, whether they would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits of the scheme using the tilted balance pursuant to paragraph 11D2 of the framework. In contrast to its approach of the Orwell appeal, the council has not commissioned an architect as a witness to advance its case at this appeal. Neither has any of the council officers responsible for the report to committee, which led to the putative reason for refusal on townscape, been called to give evidence. Instead, Mr. Lowndes has been proffered to defend the council's position, notwithstanding his lack of involvement at any relevant stage and his instruction only a few weeks before evidence was due to be exchanged. By contrast, ma'am, the appellant has commissioned Macawa Architects from the outset, years ago, to lead its engagement with the council and other key stakeholders and to evolve its plans in a considered and responsive way. I submit that you can and should attach substantial weight to Mr. Macawa's 40 years professional experience and his remarkable track record of instructions in relation to some of the most iconic and successful regeneration projects in this country. It's very clear that Mr. Macawa has got under the skin of Battleton and has proposed a scheme which will bring about hugely valuable renewal for the town centre. He does not shy away from the scale of the change which will be involved here, as in so many of his other projects, but large-scale change is needed to address problems of the enormity which Battleton faces. in my submission, the town is extremely fortunate to have found in BEL a party willing and able to commission and implement a scheme with the vision and potential of the appeal proposals. In relation to the proposed architecture, Mr. Lowndes for the council concedes the appropriateness of the podium and tower approach, and that the architectural design and treatment of the towers properly draws reference from the modernist characteristics of Battleton. However, as at the Orwell appeal, the focus of his written evidence was the, and I quote, celebrated singularity of Brooke House and the uncomfortable proximity of the proposed towers to Brooke House, quoting from him on both occasions. Mr. Macaur and Ms. Markham strongly disagree and have given compelling evidence in respect of the careful consideration which has gone into the placement and height of the new towers to complement Brooke House, whilst at the same time contributing to an emerging new skyline for the centre of Basildon. What is also notable, really notable by the fact we haven't had to spend time on this, ma'am, is that the 4 new towers have been designed and ordered successfully so as to avoid any adverse impacts in relation to privacy and overlooking, in relation to shading or overshadowing, wind effects, or any other potential environmental impact associated with this form of development. This is also a significant achievement of the design. The council's case was laid out, of course, in Mr. Lowndes' proof before the outcome of the Orwell appeal was known. Mr. Rose's decision does now answer many of the parallel points run by the council against the BEL appeal scheme. I just set out a few of these. Mr. Rose does not accept that Brooke House is a lone tall building, but notes the others around the town centre which form part of its current wider surroundings. He considers that the singularity of Brooke House in certain views will be removed and overall eroded. I'm afraid I don't accept, as Mr. Edwards suggested, that that second reference, eroded, in the concluding paragraph is confined to the view from the railway platform. And I leave you to read paragraph 45 and form your own view, ma'am. However, he considers that Brooke House's preeminence or primacy flows first from its distinctive form, and second because of the contrast between vertical and horizontal on the east-west pedestrian spine. He considers that there would not be a material adverse impact on this primacy, and that Brooke House's centrepiece function would remain. Although the BEL scheme is obviously a different one, and admittedly closer to Brooke House and with taller elements, there are many similarities in relation to impacts on the townscape. I'm just going to strike out that second reference to townscape, especially the effect it will have in adding to the new cluster, as Mr. Rose put it, of taller buildings in the town centre. However, Mr. Macaur and Miss Markham simply cannot see a problem. Healthy and vibrant town centres do not exist as static organisms, frozen or fossilized at a point in time. To flourish, they must change and adapt and welcome new built forms, especially where these are being introduced to meet real and urgent unmet needs, in this case for sustainably located new housing and broader town centre regeneration. It's almost impossible to conceive of a town or city centre which has not experienced the arrival of new and taller built forms to add new points of visual interest, new vibrancy, and breathe new life into an urban environment needing renewal and additional drama in its townscape. There is no quota for the number of tall buildings in Battleton. New tall buildings will form visual and functional relationships with the old. Mr. Macaur's analogy with family relationships is, it is submitted, an apt one. There's simply no legal or policy basis for saying, because a building was once the tallest in Basildon when it was constructed 60 years ago, it must remain the tallest in perpetuity. It will, of course, retain its place in the architectural and townscape history of the town, and will continue to be revered as an example of its time. But it should not be allowed to stifle the building which Basildon needs today to embark upon its next cycle of growth and renewal. And of course, as I remarked in opening, the singularity ship has sailed, and the new cluster of tall buildings permitted at Market Square will soon take their place in the evolving skyline of Battleton Town Centre, surpassing Brook House in height. I mention only briefly and in passing the Stadtkrone analogy, which Mr. Lowndes has now sought to borrow from Mr. Griffith's report for the then appellant in the Orwell inquiry. And it's only necessary to glance at Bruno Taut's article in Ms. Markham's rebuttal appendices to see the inappropriateness of the analogy. Indeed, Brook House was never even part of the original master plan concept for Battleton, as Mr. Murphy rightly concedes in his proof. And I give you the reference. Although it is, of course, accepted and intended that the appeal proposals will have a transformative townscape impact, the appellant strongly rejects any suggestion of townscape harm arising from its proposals. And if, contrary to the evidence in Mr. Mackay and Ms. Markham, any adverse townscape impacts are found to arise, then these will need to be considered and weighed in the tilted balance see below. I touched briefly on the design code point, and it is submitted a strange and ill-considered point, which appears to have arisen from a letter written nearly a full year after the application was made from a Mr. Dawson of Essex Place Services, suggesting that a design code for Plot 2 would have been a positive addition. At no point prior to the issue of the committee report in October 2021 had there been any suggestion that the material in the DAS and DAS addendum, coupled with the Council's powers of approval, would be insufficient to secure the design quality of Towers B and C. Their location, height, and massing is, of course, fixed by the submitted parameters. The committee report even acknowledges that the application as submitted provides a high-level design code. That's what the council officers say. There can be no doubt that the council has the power to refuse any more detailed design code submitted pursuant to its proposed condition 19, which it considers to be deficient, or any reserved matters application were such considered to be inadequate. The identity of the applicant or the name of the party instructed to submit the design code or RMA is neither here nor there, as you know well now. Moreover, the council has made provision for a quality review panel to monitor and advise on these details, and you've seen that in the section 106. It's simply not conceivable that the council needs to have further details at this stage of the fenestration and materials proposed for Towers B and C, or that in the alternative, we should be driven to assume that these cannot, as a matter of principle, be satisfactorily resolved. Such a proposition is untenable. In summary, it's an empty point. Sufficient information was submitted without complaint within the application, including in the council's own words, a high-level design code. If the appeal is allowed, the council retains complete control over detailed design at all stages via its proposed condition 19 and the reserved matter submissions. So I turn finally to the tilted balance. Notwithstanding my submissions above, if there is a finding of any adverse townscape impact, then this will have to be weighed in the tilted balance to see whether it significantly and demonstrably outweighs the full suite of the benefits set out in my submissions above and in Ms. Jones's proof of evidence. Mr. Lowndes accepts in his proof and confirmed in cross-examination that the tilted balance is engaged in this case. He also accepted that all three entry points are triggered: the absence of relevant up-to-date policy, the failure to demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply, and the failure of the housing delivery test, where Battleton is right at the bottom of the national picture, even allowing for the government's COVID adjustment. The weighing exercise is, of course, for the decision maker properly directed, but it would seem extraordinary, ma'am, if any of the matters canvassed by the council at this inquiry were considered to attract sufficient weight in the tilted balance to displace the very substantial weight which should be attached to the benefits of the scheme. To the already long list must now be added the provision of a site for an early years facility to serve the new residential populations of the town centre. In reality, the only matter upon which the council has focused in its evidence has been the alleged singularity of Brook House and a misplaced aspiration not founded on development plan policy to cling to the status quo in relation to the setting of Brook House. Much of this case has lost its potency now that the Orwell appeal has been allowed. It is accepted that the wider setting of Brook House will change dramatically and in a highly positive way once the Orwell and appeal schemes are completed. But the key aspects of its, and that is Brook House's local setting, as noted in the list description, will be unaffected, and it will retain its architectural and historic status as the grandfather of the tall buildings which will cluster at the heart of a renewed and regenerated Battleton. If an adverse townscape impact is found to arise, then it is submitted that this must be comprehensively outweighed in the tilted balance by the multiple gains to benefits of the scheme, as referenced above, which will bring about a dramatic and desperately needed revival of so many aspects of the life and vitality of Battleton's town centre, and deliver nearly 500 dwellings to boost the lamentably low supply of housing in the borough. On the basis of the evidence I've called, ma'am, in these submissions, I respectfully request on behalf of BEL that the appeal be allowed, subject to the agreed proposed conditions and the agreed Section 106 planning obligation, which we've undertaken will be with you by next Friday. Now, can I just check and see whether there's anything that I've missed before I finally close? I hope, ma'am, you have been able to make or note any corrections that I've made to the closings or supplements that I've made as I've gone along. I can send you a absolutely final version if you would like, that picks up the points that I've altered or supplemented during the delivery, but I'm in your hands as to that. I think you're on mute, ma'am.
Don't worry, Mr. Hill, that's absolutely fine.
In that case, ma'am, those are my closings, and I have no further points to make.
Thank you very much. In terms of accepting those documents that have come through, the final list of conditions which has come through, I haven't had a look at it, but it has come through. That's IQ, I'll take that as IQ 24, and then the closings I'll take as the council's 25, Rule 6 26, and the appellant 27. Okay, then it's now just gone 12:30. Is there anything else that we need to finally pick up on? Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Mr. Hill, to Miss Hall, and to Mr. Edwards, and to the witnesses. Very helpful in coming to my deliberations. Nothing else that we need to address now. So I will formally close the inquiry, and I will await the submission of the Section 106 in accordance with the agreed timetable. Thank you very much, everyone. The inquiry is now closed. Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a lovely weekend.
Thank you, ma'am.
You too, thank you.